replaced by the Gestapo. The old Jewish hospital in the Scheunenviertel or Bahn district had been used as a home for refugee children from Eastern Europe since the First World War. From 1941 to 1943, the Nazis misappropriated the building as an assembly camp for Berlin Jews before deporting them to the extermination camps. In most cases, the deportees weren't told the day they would leave the assembly camp.
I was making some money by delivering rolls in the morning before school. One of the people I would deliver to was a Jewish physician in Spandau. I will never forget the distrustful, frightened eyes of his wife every time I rang the bell to let them know that the rolls were there. She was in constant fear of being arrested by the Nazis.
The dictator made very few public appearances during the war, fearing he would become the target of an Allied precision attack, and he was rarely in Berlin. The longest he stayed in the Reich capital was 10 days in 1943. As a result, he had no first-hand experience of what his subjects were going through.
Adolf Hitler was in Berlin in the autumn of 1940 during several relatively minor air raids. By chance, or what Adolf Hitler would have called premonition, he happened not to be in Berlin during any of the heavy raids from the beginning of 1941 to the autumn of 1944. Sometimes he would board his private train and leave Berlin just a few hours before a raid. Sometimes he didn't come to Berlin for several months. In any case, Hitler never visited any of the areas hit. He left that to his propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels.
In February 1944, Goebbels wrote in his diary,
"The Führer has expressed very warm words for the composure of Berlin's population. He stresses that Berlin has truly become the Reich's capital during the air raids of the previous months. The bravery of Berlin's citizens demonstrated during the attacks was not thought possible in large parts of the German nation and in the entire world."
Still, Nazi leaders were looking into improved protection measures for the citizens from the bombs so as to keep up their resolve on the home front. More and more residential buildings were hit or destroyed in a firestorm by the Allied high-explosive or incendiary bombs. A result of these deliberations can be seen in a forest 100 kilometers north of Berlin. Odd-looking shelter constructions on the grounds of the former secret Luftwaffe test site in Rechlin. The locals have named them White Houses. Documents of the time provide information concerning the purpose of the mysterious shelters. According to them, incendiary bombs were tested on these towers in July and August 1943. The documents refer to a Berlin borough, so these buildings may have been model houses for Hitler's capital, Germania, which were tested here to see just how bomb-proof they were. Were Berlin citizens to survive the bombing attacks in this way, in standardized houses with built-in shelter towers from reinforced concrete? There is no clear answer to this question. The results of the bombing tests on these prototypes are also unknown. By then, the sirens howled in Berlin almost daily. Sometimes, people had to spend entire days and nights in the air raid shelters. Latecomers were faced with locked doors. Going in and out of shelters became everyday routine for many Berliners, including the staff and patients of the city's hospitals. At the former Humboldt hospital on Teichstrasse, one of these bomb-proof shelters is open to visitors. It was built in the vicinity of the main building in 1942 and served as an operation shelter, Type A. When the alarm sounded, the post-operative patients were taken from the hospital straight into the shelter through a subterranean passage over a ramp. Behind the protection of heavy iron gates and thick reinforced concrete, The doctors could even perform complicated surgical operations. Filter systems protected physicians, nurses and patients from poisonous gases. Today, this relic from Hitler's Berlin is supervised by the Berlin Underworlds Association.
Patients had to be operated on during the bombing attacks too. However, the hospitals were not bomb-proof, and the Allied bombers, flying at an altitude of 7,000 or 8,000 meters, could not drop their payload accurately enough to spare the hospitals, which had red crosses painted on the roof. From March 1944 onwards, when the Americans started to bomb Berlin during the day, operations were always performed in the shelters. As far as the equipment was available, nearly all hospitals moved their operating rooms into the shelters simply for safety reasons. Altogether, we had 28 operation shelters in Berlin. Every major hospital had one or two. The fact that this one is so well preserved is actually just a historical coincidence. It was used for many years as a storage facility for the Senate, until our association took this shelter under our wing 1.5 years ago. Now we're gradually restoring it.
Fittings and surgical instruments from the time were collected from all around Germany in order to outfit the shelter as accurately in every detail as possible. After Joseph Goebbels' declaration of total war, his propaganda machinery kept inventing new rallying calls. "Our walls are broken, but not our hearts," was one of the cynical slogans. Others included, "The warring city of Berlin greets the Führer," and "Führer command, we will obey." Despite the precautions the Nazis had taken, Berlin city centre was also heavily hit by bombs several times. On Hitler's orders, 3 enormous anti-aircraft towers had been hurriedly erected for the protection of the government district. The remains of one of these flak towers can still be found today at Humboldt, north of the city centre. The reinforced concrete giant was only partly destroyed when the victors tried to demolish it. A few years ago, the Berlin Underworlds Association was granted permission to open the existing entrances and explore the tower's interior. Tons of rubble were removed from the ruin before a first inspection of the bizarre bunker system became possible. Gradually, elevator shafts and former ammunition depots were revealed. It was sometimes a risky business for the researchers. Today, parts of the gigantic structure are accessible. The structure was shaken by the blasting attempts of the Allies after the war. The ceiling sagged visibly. Whether or not they will cave in one day is unclear. When put into service in 1942, the Flak Tower was classified as indestructible, and this is obviously still true today, if only partly. A network of corridors and staircases extend as deep as 8 stories below the ground.
Maybe we should put up a proper fence here, down there at the back. This is as far as it goes. We're now in the so-called turret 3 of the Humboldt Flak Tower, an anti-aircraft tower which consisted of 4 gun turrets. Facing us here are the main elevator shaft and the main spiral staircase. The elevator shaft went from the ground floor to the 4th floor. The stairs went another floor up to the 5th floor. The stairwell was actually only used by the garrison until 1943, when the civilian population was permitted to use it for seating because there weren't enough bunker facilities in Berlin. What you can see here are the effects of the blastings. The entire stairwell has caved in, except for the area between the 5th and the 4th floor, and there are huge chunks of reinforced concrete still hanging from the walls. So it's extremely dangerous to venture down there, because in some parts, these chunks, which weigh tons, could come loose at any time, something you definitely want to avoid. Here you can see very clearly the damage caused by the blasting in '48 by the French occupying power. We're in the French sector here. As we know, Germany was to be demilitarized and bunkers were considered military structures. The French detonated 3 charges in total. The first had no effect whatsoever. The second destroyed only parts of the bunker, and only after the third charge did the rear end cave in. It collapsed like a house of cards. By the way, the Soviets and the Brits had the same problems with the Flak towers in their sectors. They were difficult to demolish because of the vast amounts of concrete used.
The huge concrete towers offered protection for up to 30,000 people, but also for valuable museum pieces during the Allied air raids. Even some armament production was relocated here. In the end, their heavy anti-aircraft guns were not enough to prevent the fall of Berlin. Demolishing the ruins would be far too expensive, so this relic from the Second World War will continue to be used by the bunker experts in future for research and expeditions.
Großstadtverkehr Juli 1943 in der Reichshauptstadt am Alexanderplatz. Straßenbahnen, Lastkraftwagen mit Lebensmitteln und sonstiger kriegswichtiger Ladung und ringsherum die Hochhäuser und Büros, in denen Männer und Frauen für den Sieg arbeiten.
Air raid shelter systems were built all around Berlin, including beneath the Alexanderplatz. A television film of the time about market gardening in the city centre unintentionally shows the ventilation shafts of the subterranean bunker system. Stretching over 2 stories, the Alexanderplatz bunker was the largest underground shelter in the city. According to a special plan, all mainline railway stations in Berlin were outfitted with such shelter systems during the war, with the aim of putting up travellers in the case of a bombing attack. Later in the war, residents of the area and passers-by were also allowed to use the extensive shelter.
During the final stages of the war, we had to go into the air raid shelter almost every day. By then, the war had arrived in Berlin with the bombing attacks. I remember spending many nights in the shelter. I also remember that during an event organized by the Hitler Youth, we had to go into a shelter. But because I didn't want to, I ran away and walked along the Heerstraße towards home, while the air raid was in full swing. I could see the bombers dropping their load, but I wasn't scared. I walked for over an hour from Unter den Linden all the way to Spandau, and somehow I got home unharmed.
In his function as commissary for the total war effort, Joseph Goebbels assembled Volkssturm or Home Guard divisions in late 1944 and had them march in front of the Brandenburg Gate for propaganda purposes.
Der Tag des Volkssturms ist ein kraftvoller Beweis dafür, dass kein Feindterror das deutsche Volk beugen kann und dass die Herzen seiner Menschen über Masse, Material und Hass triumphieren werden.
The elderly, members of the Hitler Youth, semi-invalids and even women were trained to use anti-tank rocket launchers with the intention of stopping the advancing Red Army. At the beginning of February 1945, Goebbels declared Berlin a fortress. Adolf Hitler had his final appearance on the newsreel of the 20th of March. The Führer decorated Hitler Youth boys who had fought Soviet units with their bazookas. Shortly before the end, even the last underage reserves were mobilized and mercilessly annihilated in street fighting. The Olympic Tower was also converted into a stronghold of fanatic Nazi no-surrender terror. Here too, child soldiers were deployed in an attempt to halt the Soviet advance into the city center. All of those unwilling to participate in this senseless suicide mission were publicly shot.
The
Volkssturm men and Hitler Youth boys, who were the last contingent, had barricaded themselves in at several locations with orders to defend the government district. One of these places was the Reich sports field. At the end of April 1945, at least 3, maybe even 4,000 Hitler Youth boys confronted the far superior Red Army. How many of them died remains uncertain.
I
didn't want the Russians to capture Berlin, so I wanted to defend the city at any cost. Better dead than a slave was one of the slogans they had hammered into us. Self-sacrifice is an heroic deed. I honestly admit that I was quite prepared to sacrifice myself because this was how I was brought up, to defend the fatherland by all means, even accepting death.
Das Vaterland zu verteidigen, dass ich auch den Tod in Kauf genommen hätte.
The Führer didn't care about the senseless sacrifice of the Hitler Youth boys and his soldiers. He didn't leave his last bastion alive. On the 6th of May 1945, the defenders were forced to leave the Chancellery of the Reich through the open gates of the subterranean bunkers before a running camera. This appearance of Hitler's last disciples was staged by the Soviets for the newsreel at home. The curious victors wandered across the heavily damaged seat of government of the dictator. Hitler's charred body was found buried in the garden, not far from the remains of his designated successor. Josef and Magda Goebbels had poisoned their 6 children shortly before the capitulation and then committed suicide. The history of National Socialist Berlin was over. Tanks that had participated in the capture of Berlin flanked the Soviet monument at the Reichstag, which the victors erected at the end of 1945 in memory of those fallen in the Great Patriotic War. For many decades, it was suggested that stones from Hitler's new chancellery were used in its construction to symbolize the victory over National Socialism. But this is probably just a propagandistic legend that helped to seal the fall of Hitler's Berlin.